I got a huge inheritance I didn't know was coming. It's huge. It's big. Completely unexpected. I'm going to tell you all about it. At least as through the eyes of the main character in a story told first person format called Uncle Burton's Diary. This one comes from Bigfoot Sasquatch Files. I clearly heard something running behind me. You're definitely going to have to get my 6. This story comes from Bigfoot Sasquatch Files, Volume 9. 1 through 10 of which are now available currently from our Etsy store in print, autographed copies. The link is in the description box below. To read you this one, I must go back into grandpa mode here. Uncle Burton's Diary. And please get my 6. Let's see if whatever just ran through there comes back. Uncle Bert, as we called him, though I'm sure his mother would have called him Burton as a child at times when he was in trouble, was not a rich man. He was a just enough to get by and by God grateful for it kind of guy. Uncle Bert, like our entire clan, came from hard-working stock, where a man's hard work was rewarded by enough to survive, and even better, the affordance of a great night's sleep. I'm hearing something behind me. And we're hearing communications that sound like crow calls, so you keep watching, keep listening. Our people never fancied the finer things in life, so materialism was never part of our way. I guess that's why I was surprised when I got a call last spring telling me that I'd inherited something from my recently deceased Uncle Bert. When I found out that my inheritance was merely a diary I had no clue the man had kept, my mind was set at ease. Rather, my mind was set back to reality. As for a fleeting moment, I fancied Uncle Bert having had jars of cold hard cash buried around his property, which his attorney had collected and pulled together, and that I had been deemed the lone recipient of all that cold hard cash. I asked Mr. Esquire, while I had him on the phone, if he could mail the diary. It was then that I was made aware of the very odd condition that came with my inheritance, that being that I would only accept the diary while in the presence of Mr. Esquire, and only in his offices. I would be locked in the drawing room of Mr. Esquire's offices, as his offices were found to be in an old house built in the late 1880s, where I would read the diary in its entirety, alone, and then burn the diary in the fireplace, which would be burning hot upon my arrival. As you can imagine, I found this condition quite odd. Why would I, or anyone, drive nearly 4 hours in one direction to read the diary of a recently deceased man who'd, and with all respect given as I say this, never accomplished anything that anyone would consider meaningful outside of our little village in Appalachistan? As I stated earlier, Uncle Bert was one hell of a hard worker. He was an honest man, and boy could he really spin a yarn. I'd listened to plenty of his yarns in my youth, but the fact of the matter is, the man never made it past the 8th grade, and he spent 40 years working as a lumberjack, either logging or driving log trucks, and though he'd been all over the mountains of his native Appalachistan, he'd never left them, save for the time or two when he ventured back to the motherland of Virginia to visit the beach, both times of which he stated upon returning home he could have saved time and money heading over to the lake for a dip. He also pointed out that there wouldn't have been so damn many people either. However, just as I was about to decline my inheritance, I remembered something that Uncle Bert had said to me after telling me one whopper of his yarns. He told me the story more than 40 years ago, and I remember asking him, when he was finished with the telling, if it were true, and he told me that as sure as he and I were breathing air, that it was true. When I'd asked him to prove it to me, which he could have easily done at the time, he told me that he feared doing so because, in his own words, the thing was so close to human, and he never took the Lord's name in vain, that I'm scared they'll put me away for manslaughter. And I trust you, boy, he'd continued, but not with my life. Look, let me tell you what I've learned about secrets. The only way to keep a secret between 3 people is if 2 of them are dead. But even more chilling than this, what he said next led me to believe that the story was true, and I feel as if I've known this for these past 40 years. What he said was, "When I'm dead and safe, I'll prove it to you. Beyond the shadow of any doubt, I'll prove it to you." "Can I come and do the reading this evening?" I asked Mr. Esquire over the phone after having this memory. "My offices are open until 5 p.m., but I can stay a little later if needed," he said. "If I leave now," I said, "I can be there by 5. I'll call ahead if I'm running behind." "That will do," he said, and we ended the call. 15 minutes later, I was on the road, heading back to the hills of Appalachistan. The whole while driving, I heard Uncle Bert's voice in my head. The voice was retelling the stories from all those years ago, but the story that the voice told the most, over and over as if none of the other stories had ever mattered, was a story I will relate to you now. Uncle Bert and I had gone native brook trout fishing. For those readers unfamiliar with the activity, I will point out that it's actually a combination of many activities in one. Firstly, it's part hiking. One cannot successfully fish for native brook trout without walking at least 5 or 6 miles on an average day of doing so. And it's more than the most simple form of hiking, as there's no trail. There is a slippery, rocky creek bank that often winds with the creek under laurel bushes or through rocky ravines hardly surpassable by a billy goat. There are often steep climbs and equally steep descents, often laden with moss-covered rocks and logs. There are briar and bramble patches to crawl through, around, or over, and among all these already treacherous obstacles, there lies the occasional rattlesnake or copperhead, both deadly venomous. Native brook trout fishing requires quite the stalking ability, so it's one part sniper, for lack of a better description. You see, the very small fish, which technically are not even a form of trout, but rather an Arctic char, which were left in certain northeast streams during the last ice age, when the glaciers had actually pushed their way as far south as central West by God, Virginia. Before retreating and melting, they are very skittish. Even if a stiff wind blows a tree branch which is hanging above the small pool of water which they inhabit, the small fish will dart under a rock or the edge of the bank and stay hidden, at times for the rest of the day, upon sight of said tree branch. So, while one is traversing the rugged terrain where the streams are located that house these small fish, catching one of 8 inches or more in length is to catch a real monster, one must do so quietly and cautiously. More than once this rider had spent 10 minutes or more sneaking up on a beautiful hole of water, maybe 3 feet wide by the same length and about a foot deep, only to stumble over a fallen limb or slip on a rock at the last second and sadly see that beautiful 6-inch long native brook trout dart up underneath the bank on either side and not come out again for the day. One must be a naturalist and a keen observer to successfully fish for native brook trout, for you see, there are constantly different types of insects hatching at different times of the year, and in order to have the most success with catches, one must match one's bait to the hatch. If black gnats are hatching, like mad, the 1st of June, using what worked only a week before, a May fly pattern, dry fly, won't work at all. And certainly not lastly, one must be quite proficient at casting. It's not just about hitting one's mark on the water, it's about not hitting the many obstacles before the bait even gets there, like numerous tree branches, boulders, logs, bushes, etc. Take a brief water break. I'm sitting in the middle of a black gnat hatch as I read this. Too bad there's no native brook trout stream that aren't really trout stream right here, huh? Almost there, Uncle Bert said. We had hiked about 4 miles upstream. We'd set out at first light and it was nearing noon. 4 miles of native brook trout fishing on a stream about 1.5 feet wide and 8 inches deep, on average, with the occasional pools of 6 feet by 6 feet that might have been 18 inches deep, meant that we were making pretty good time. To this day, I hate to admit this, and it certainly isn't the way I would do things if I could go back and do them differently. Uncle Bert and I both had 24 brook trout each in our plastic bread bags we used to carry our catches in. We put one hell of a hurting on the native brook trout populations in those mountains, and we had a pretty crappy attitude about it too. You see, We knew that everyone else kept all the fish they caught. Catch and release was a practice we viewed as being for the yuppies who came into our area from the cities to fly fish once or twice a year so they could go back to their doctors' and lawyers' offices where they proudly hung their far too expensive Orvis fly rods over their fake gas-burning fireplaces and prattle on to their patients and clients about how they are prodigious fly fishermen and how they brave the natives and travel into the heart of Appalachistan twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall, to catch the most elusive fish to be caught in North America. We locals, dumb hillbillies as those yuppies called us in hushed tones, we, on the other hand, kept and ate every GD fish we caught. Right up here's the head of it, Uncle Bert said, as we made our final push to where this stream actually started. You see, many of these native brook trout streams we fished were so small that they didn't even show up on any of the topographical maps produced by the Forest Service. Many of them simply shot up out of the spring hole at either the top of a mountain or part of the way down. The streams may run for only a few miles before flowing into a larger stream. These, of course, are called tributaries. But a good many of them simply gave out. 1 minute, water is flowing. The next, it just stops. Admittedly, very few of the streams that just stopped had any trout in them, but most of the ones that were tributaries did. The one we'd been fishing on that day was a small tributary that flowed into yet another tributary that was actually recorded on a map. But this stream was too small to have been recorded. Just above us, the whole time we'd been making our way up the stream, there was a road, the type of road called a haul road. It derived its name from the purpose it had been cut through the forest anyway to serve, the hauling of logs from mountain to mill. Uncle Bert had cut the haul road above us the spring before. We were out on a beautiful fall day, and we'd actually pondered whether to go native brook trout fishing on this particular day or turkey hunting. We had chosen fishing over hunting, knowing that winter would soon come to our part of Appalachistan, freezing the waters of these small streams and burying the land in feet of snow. We could at least hunt in such weather, so we'd chosen to fish while the weather still permitted, though there was one such time when this writer went fishing on this same stream later in life, at the age of 17, just to prove that fish could be caught in sub-freezing temperatures. I caught 3 on a day when it was 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I had to suck on the last eyelet on my fishing rod after reeling in every cast, because the tiny water beads would turn to ice and lock the line so that I could not cast unless unfreezing the whole mess with my mouth first. By catching those 3 brook trout that day, I won a bet with a naysayer. Though the naysayer never paid up, I'd proven my point. Despite weather conditions, all animals must eat. Let's head up here to the road and have our lunch, Uncle Bert said. We walked up the hill just below the point where the stream we'd been fishing actually began. Sure enough, it shot up, as a spring, from underneath a huge limestone boulder. I'd noticed while crawling up the bank to get to the haul road, which was already beginning to grow over with new vegetation, that it appeared as if there was a sister spring, or a twin spring, as they were both frequently called, coming from underneath an entire collection of rocks. It looked almost as if they'd been bulldozed over the hill, as if to cover up the stream. "Looks like another spring," I said to Uncle Bert as I maneuvered over the rocks and reached the road. "Yeah," he said, but that was all he said. He made his way to what would have been the log landing, the wide point at the end of this haul road, where he would have loaded with a huge piece of machinery called a log loader the actual logs he'd cut down and dragged to this collection point onto the back of whatever timber truck he would have driven up this tight, steep, barely surpassable road. FYI, if you've never watched a logging operation, it is worth searching up and watching on YouTube after this video. It is absolutely amazing, some of the places these loggers take vehicles into the woods and the work they do there. These men and a few women who work in the industry manage to take these behemoth pieces of machinery up what are practically trails that would be challenging for a four-wheeler, load them up with an entire truck's worth of logs, and then haul them back off the mountain and to the mills. "I was up here alone the last day of this job," Uncle Bert said, biting into a Spam sandwich, a hillbilly delicacy. "I'd already hauled all the logs to the landing here," he said between chews, "and I was just loading them onto the truck. It was a Saturday, I remember that. It's why Billy and Cephas were off. I came out and got the job wrapped up by myself so that on Monday we could start a new job over in the next county." Uncle Bert described how he was loading the logs onto the truck by the way of the log loader, which actually sits on top of the back of the timber truck. Those separate parts, a timber truck is often one large, do-it-all piece of machinery. It's got to be in order to get all the different parts up into the working area conveniently. I'd noticed that big pool of water down there, he said, continuing his story. I'd been glancing over there the whole time. I'd swung around to the left there to grab another log, to bring over to the right to load up on the truck. I just knew there were trout in there, and if I could just see one, why, I was going to bring you up here fishing with me. I guess you saw one, I said, lifting my bread bag, overfilled with fish. I reckon you can say that, Uncle Bert said. Not just one, but two, and they were both about the biggest native brook trout I'd ever seen in my life. Had to be at least a foot long each. My God, I said. At that time, I'd never caught a native brook trout that big. Years later, I would catch one that was 13 inches long, and to this day, nearly 40 years later, I've never caught one that big since. My God is right, he said, but what happened next brought me back to my senses real quick. What happened, I asked. I remember being hungry, but I also remember being so into Uncle Bert's story that I couldn't take another bite of my PB&J until he continued. Now, you probably ain't going to believe this next part, he said, and I became even more excited to hear the next part. How could I not, if he'd already told me it was unbelievable? Well, he said, continuing, looking down at the ground as if in deep thought, remembering the events of that day and completely forgetting that he held a delicious half-eaten Spam sandwich in his hand. While I was still staring down at those two fish, I was swinging the log I'd just picked up in the pinchers around to the right, over toward the truck. And all of a sudden, I hit something. The boom stopped as the log bounced off of whatever I'd hit. What'd you hit? I asked. Well, he said, that's just it. I knew the coast was clear. I'd done swung half a dozen other logs through there. There weren't no other people around. We're miles out of town up here, and it couldn't have been an obstruction. Why, I looked down from the cab and I couldn't see anything. I figured there might have been a kink in the boom gears or something, so I just loaded that log up and kept on going. I loaded 8 or 10 more logs and filled the whole truck. It was only after that, when I climbed down from the cab, that I realized what I'd done. Uncle Bert hanged his head, not in shame, but in a way that looked remorseful. What was it? I asked. This here's the part you probably ain't going to believe, he said. I said nothing, even as a child, knowing it was best to give the man the time needed to collect his next spoken words properly. I saw, he said, when he finally spoke, laying right there in the mud, something that looked like the biggest GD man I'd ever seen in my life, except it was naked, covered with hair, and had the face of what? I asked after he'd trailed off and didn't seem like he was coming back. Well, he said, that's part of the story. See, I guess when I'd swung that big red oak log around while I was gawking over the hill at those fish, this thing or this guy just snuck right up on me, and I never saw him or it, and I smashed him right in the face with that big old log that had to weigh a ton if it weighed an ounce, and I just caved his whole face right in. Looked like the front of his head had been smashed in by a cannonball the size of a large watermelon. I sat in silence, knowing not what to say. Bert sat in silence as well, fearing he might say too much. When he finally spoke again, he said, I'll be GD'd if I didn't go and kill one of them there Bigfoot Sasquatches. No way, I said. Yes way, he said, and as if he'd never been touched emotionally by the retelling of the story, he once again took up eating his delicious Spam sandwich. Is this story true? I asked him. I knew he could tell some whoppers, but the way he'd acted during the telling of this particular story led me to believe that this story was not a whopper, but a confession. As sure as you and I are breathing air right now, this story is true, he said. Prove it, I said. He told me that he could and that he'd love to, but that the thing he'd killed with the log had so closely resembled a human being that he was afraid that he'd get locked up for manslaughter. He told me he trusted me as much as he trusted anyone, but that one of the cold hard facts that he learned about life was that the only way to keep a secret between 3 people was if 2 of them were dead. He told me not to worry, though, because he said that when he died and could no longer be carted off to prison, he'd prove it. For the life of me, I will never cease to be amazed how steep the mountains of Appalachistan are. No matter how many times I go back, though I'll admit it's not often, and it's intentional, I'm always aghast at the sheer steep climbs. I spent a couple of years living on the West Coast, and folks out there like to tell me that we didn't even have mountains back east. We only had hills, they claimed. Their Rockies and their Cascades were real mountains, they would tell me. I had to give it to them, because in so many ways they were right. But I'd always challenge these one-uppers to come back east with me and hike a day through the Appalachians and see if they could walk the next day. I never got any takers. I rode into the offices of Mr. Esquire just as darkness fell. It wasn't quite night yet, it was evening, but being that it was the month of March and the shifting of the clocks forward had not yet occurred, it was still getting darker a bit earlier than I preferred. "Are you prepared to follow the instructions as I gave them to you?" Mr. Esquire asked. "I am," I said. He then handed me the diary, which had a lock on the front of it as well as a sealed envelope. "What's this?" I asked, nodding toward the envelope I held in my left hand while holding the diary in my right. "Instructions to find the key," he said. He grabbed me by the elbow, ever so lightly, and guided me into an adjacent room where a single straight-backed leather chair sat before a raging fire. There was a couch off to the side of the room with an end table beside it. "I'll lock you in from the outside," he said. "When you are finished and want out, simply knock." "Okay," I said, feeling as if I'd somehow been swept into an early 1900s English novel. Mr. Esquire left the room. I could hear the lock latch as he turned the key from the outside. I sat in the straight-backed chair before the fire and stared into the flames. I found myself thinking that I could not believe I'd just driven 4 hours to perform such a task. What on earth could be in this diary? And how more could it answer my question from all those years before than by simply stating the story was true? Weren't there better things I could be doing with my time? Without further thinking or further hesitation, I opened the envelope. There was a piece of paper inside upon which was written a single, simple sentence. "Look under your cushion." I stood and pulled up the cushion on the chair upon which I'd been sitting, and sure enough, there was a small silver key there. I took it up, replaced the cushion, then sat back down before the fire. I put the key in the latch of the diary, opened it, and found that the entire book was empty save for one page. A page close to the middle had been marked by way of the ribbon marker protruding from the spine of the diary. There was a note here, nay, a letter, and it read, "K. If you're reading this before a blazing fire in Mr. Esquire's offices, then I trust you never quite got over your curiosity of the story I told you years ago. Before I prove to you the truth of my tale, I must first point out my fascination about the single biggest question you never asked me either at the time I told you my tale or later when you had nearly 40 years to ask. That question being, what did I do with the body? I'm glad, Kay, that you never asked this question because as an honest man, I was never good at lying, and I feared this question would come from you, and there would be no way I could get out of letting you know the answer. If your lack of questioning in this regard was intentional, I thank you, from my grave, for saving me the awful situation of having to either lie or answer it outright. With this said, I will now give you the answer to that question you never asked. I buried it. Where? I must first point out that on the day that I told you the story, I did tell one lie. I hesitated, forgetting I held a delicious Spam sandwich in my hand at the time, doing my best to keep a poker face so you would not discover my dishonesty. I suppose it worked. I feel like something's been creeping right up behind me this whole time. If you guys are seeing anything move back there, make sure to put timestamps. Back to our story. It wasn't untrue that my mind had been distracted by my viewing of 2 large native brook trout in the hole of water off to my left. That is very true. The part that is not true is that it was the wrong hole of water. If you'll remember, as we climbed that creek bank all those years ago, you pointed out that it appeared as if another stream was coming from another spring which was under rocks. Rocks, if you'll remember, that appeared to have been pushed over the hillside by a bulldozer. Okay? It appeared as if there was another stream here, coming from another spring, because there was. Before those rocks were there, rocks that I did indeed push into the hollow with the blade on the front of one of my log skidders, there was a sister hole which appeared nearly identical to the hole of water that you did see. It was in this hole that 2 large native brook trout tread water, and into this hole that I did peer as I carelessly swung a log around to my right, without looking first, and smashing it into the face of a creature that was nearly as human as you and I. As I mentioned to you the day I told this story, what I'd killed was so human that I honestly felt as if I might go to prison for killing it. I had not harmed the creature intentionally, and I meant no malice in what I did next, but I was out to save my own hide. I pushed the creature, which had to have been 8 feet tall and weighed nearly 800 pounds, over the hill and into that beautiful pool of water where I'd been staring at those beautiful trout, though understandably, trout that were the furthest thing from my mind by this time. Then, I pushed every large rock and small boulder I could find into the ravine, burying the body with mostly limestone and sandstone, and then I was sure to flatten it out as best I could, so to make it all appear natural. I'll admit that part of taking you fishing there so that you could see the area was to make sure someone who didn't know what had happened wouldn't be able to tell that the land had been manipulated. I guess my workmanship passed the test, at least yours. Does this prove to you, Kay, that my story is true? In my mind, it does. In your mind, it might not. If you want further proof from this point, well, that is up to you. You're a clever man. I know you can figure out what to do next if there is a next step for you. As far as I'm concerned, I know I can rest in eternity, having taken this secret to my grave, but also having made my confession posthumous. Now, burn this diary, you dumb hillbilly. Love, Uncle Bert. I sat staring into the fire, pondering the validity of the confession, as it were, that I'd just read. Could this be true? Was this a prank from Uncle Bert from beyond the grave? An excellent storyteller he'd always been, but a prankster that had never been his way. I stood slowly, tossed the diary into the fire, which was now beginning to burn down a bit, and I sat back down and watched the book burn. After it burned beyond recognition, I rose, turned, and walked to the door. I rapped on it lightly with the knuckle of the middle finger on my right hand. I could hear the more than a century-old floorboards on the other side of the room creaking as Mr. Esquire came to free me from my chamber. As Mr. Esquire opened the door, he held a pillow and a folded blanket. I know it's quite a drive back to the motherland of Virginia, he said, and it's getting late. FYI, the couch in the same room in which you are leaving is more comfortable than any motel bed in the county. There are no hotels in this part of Appalachistan, only really crappy rundown motels. And if you'd like to spend the night, you're welcome to do so. There's food aplenty in the kitchen and you can let yourself out in the morning. I thought for a minute, and it was obvious that Mr. Esquire could read my thoughts as he grinned at my ponderance. It was not the long drive back to the motherland of Virginia that made me consider staying. It was the certain head of a certain hollow between two certain hills where a stream not located on any topographical maps lay that was piquing my curiosity and tempting me to stay. That's kind of you, Mr. Esquire, I said. I believe I'll take you up on your offer. He smiled as he handed me the pillow and the blanket. He turned to leave, and as he grabbed the doorknob of the front door, he turned and simply said, "There are a few things in a sack you might be needing, just inside the closet there." With this, he nodded toward a door in the room in which I would sleep before the fire, and then he walked out the front door, shut it, and locked it. With that, I was alone. Out of curiosity, I made my way to the door, which he nodded toward, opened it, and within found a large green military-style luggage sack. I opened it and found that it contained a pickaxe and a shovel and 3 pairs of gloves. I went to the couch, lay out my bedding, got under the blanket, and shut my eyes. But I didn't sleep a wink all night. I'm sensing movement and motion. You guys keep watching back here. Around 4 a.m. All right, guys. Something weird just happened that hasn't happened in a long time. My camera flashed like bright and then just stopped recording. So I have to restart. Sorry for that. This has been a long one. Thanks for sticking in there with me. There's just a couple pages left. Okay, but keep watching. I don't think I'm alone up here. Someone or something has been coming very close to hear this story, and I think they like it. But I think they may have gotten too close to the camera and zapped the camera. Keep watching. Didn't sleep a wink all night. Around 4 a.m. I gave up. What was the use? It was well into the next day, though the sun still lacked a couple of hours from rising. I would not wait for it. I would leave. However, my destination was not my comfortable, vast estate back in the motherland of Virginia. It was up one of the deepest, darkest hollows in Appalachia. So far up, as our native son and hero Chuck Yeager would have said, that they had to pump sunshine into it. After an hour and a half's drive up several old roads that got only smaller and smaller, more narrow with each passing mile, I came to the point where vehicle would no longer take me, even though said vehicle is a totally awesome Dodge Ram 1500 four-wheel drive pick-em-up truck that would make any Prius owner's you-know-what go limp upon sight. Came now the rest of the journey that could only be made on foot. I was a mile up the trail when the sun came up bright enough for me to see. I'd had no problem making my way in the pre-dawn light, more like a glow for those late risers who aren't familiar with the light of the early dawn. As the old haul road Uncle Bert had cut himself all those years ago still remained, though there were now trees littered throughout it, some nearly 2 feet in diameter. Time marches on, saplings and seedlings become mighty trees, and men and women grow old. An hour after the sun had risen, I reached my destination, the old log landing on top of the mountain. Though I remain to this day in great shape, participating in the occasional 5K road race for charity, it had been so long since I'd hiked up one of those hills in Appalachia, and I was reminded of the challenge I used to give my mates back on the West Coast. The challenge that none of them ever accepted, and it damn near got the best of me. Without wasting any time, I began removing rocks that made flat land of where I knew originally there was a ravine. Though temperatures had been in the 80s the day before when I'd left my beautiful home in Virginia, the temperatures at this high elevation in Appalachia hovered around 40. There was still snow and ice, and it made for a slower go of it. But rock by rock, stone by stone, I made my way through the earth. After an hour's time of work, I reached running water, the original spring, but I found nothing. No skeleton, no skull, no nothing. I'd been had, I said to myself, sitting beside the bank well into mid-morning. I opened the old military luggage sack again and took out 2 sandwiches I'd made just before leaving the offices of Mr. Esquire. Havarti cheese and uncured salami on wheat bread with fat-free mayonnaise. Mr. Esquire and I, it appeared, had similar tastes in cheese and meats. I could not imagine how far Mr. Esquire had driven, though, to find the Havarti, for they certainly did not sell Havarti cheese in the part of Appalachia where his offices were located. That's it, I said, thinking of Mr. Esquire. They're in on it together. And they had to be. How could they not be? The way Mr. Esquire... I heard like a grunt. How could they have not been in it together? The way Mr. Esquire had simply told me of the tools in the sack in the closet, tools he knew would come in handy for some sort of digging. How could he not have been aware of that for which I'd be digging? Further, he'd intentionally lured me into staying the night at his offices. He seemed far too ready with that pillow and blanket when he'd unlocked the door and opened it. It was as if he wanted to make sure I did not flee. Those sons of a B-words, I said, peeling the crust off my sandwich and throwing it to the other side of the water hole that I'd uncovered. It was then and only then that my thoughts stopped in their tracks. The bit of bread I'd tossed to the other side of the water hole had been caught, just above ground level, by what appeared to be a stick. But this stick was not quite the color of any stick I'd seen before. At most, it resembled the color of a sycamore tree, but there were no sycamores in the area. Further, the end of it appeared to have been whittled by a knife, and the odds of such a thing seemed completely remote to me. I stood, and already wet from the knees down, walked through the water to the other side of the small pool. I bent over to inspect the bread and the stick upon which it had been caught. This is when a sudden terror came over me as I realized this was no stick. It was a bone, a finger bone. But unlike any finger bone I'd ever seen, not that I'd seen many finger bones, if any, it was huge. I removed the bread crust from the bone and then began removing some of the other stones and soil around the finger. What I found was that this finger was attached to an entire hand. I've attended only one NBA basketball game in my life. It was the Washington Wizards versus the Miami Heat, and the game had been held in Washington, D.C. This was during the second and what would be the final year of Michael Jordan playing for the Wizards as well as in the NBA. despite having already retired twice before this. I knew that seeing Jordan play, Shaquille O'Neal was playing that night as well for the Heat, live, would be a piece of history that I would regret missing if I didn't go to at least one game that year, so I did that day, and I'm glad I did. My point here is that during that game, I remember being so impressed by how small the basketball looked in the hands of those NBA players. They palmed the basketball like I would palm a baseball. Their hands were that big. And I explain this to the reader now, or the listener now, because what I can tell you of the skeletal remains of the hand I unearthed that day in the spring, which had formerly been hidden for the past 40 years, would have made those NBA players' hands appear as small as their hands made my hand appear to be. "Oh my God," I said, as I stared at the hand now coming up from the soil and the rocks. And it was so much more than just a hand. It was a hand that was attached to a wrist, which I would assume was attached to an arm, which was attached to a torso, etc., etc. Oh my, and then there's a bunch of bad words here. Immediately, without taking the time to think, I climbed out of the ravine, bringing my luggage sack and tools with me. Tired as I was, I made sure to bury the hand in the pool itself with a couple feet's worth of stone and rock. I hadn't covered it nearly as well as Uncle Bert had 40 years before, but I'd covered it enough to allow that which had been hidden for an equal period of time to remain hidden going forward. Fortunately, the long walk back to my totally awesome, like new Dodge Ram 1500 4x4 pick-em-up truck that would make the you-know-what on any Prius owner go limp upon sight was all downhill. Once back to my truck, I threw my supplies in the back seat and began the long drive back to my beautiful, comfortable, vast estate in the motherland of Virginia. I did not return Mr. Esquire's sack and the tools within, but I will be sending them back UPS because the post office sucks. And I am certain that Uncle Burton's secret, the secret that he took to the grave, will become a secret once again, once either Mr. Esquire or myself pass on to the other side. The end. If you enjoyed that, you can get that one and a whole heck of a lot of more by purchasing Bigfoot Sasquatch Files Anthology 1, Volumes 1 through 10. It is on Amazon in ebook version and print, but if you get it from our Etsy store, the link's in the description box below. I personally autograph it for you before I send it to you. This is the single largest collection of Bigfoot Sasquatch stories in the history of literature. And this guy, who they say is crazy, wrote it. See you for more next time.